Hello everyone, welcome to my Silent Hill F No Emma Upgrades walkthrough on Lost in the Fog difficulty for both the combat and puzzles. I will be getting the actual true ending of the game by the end of this walkthrough, but for now, this video will cover the start of the game all the way to Sakuko's boss fight. So to provide a brief rundown on how to get the actual true ending of the game, you have to be on New Game Plus, you have to get two different endings beforehand, you have to obtain and purify the Sacred Sword, you have to give away the Brooch, and you cannot consume any red capsules throughout the entire game. Since I already went through the step process for obtaining and purifying the Sacred Sword in one of my other ending attempts, I can obtain the Sacred Sword early, and also, the tub that's used to purify the Sacred Sword is already filled with the correct liquid. So this will be a straight walkthrough where such prerequisites have already been satisfied. As for Lost in the Fog difficulty for the combat, this difficulty can only be selected on New Game Plus. Obviously, in order to not have any Emma upgrades at the start of this walkthrough, I had to beat New Game without getting those Emma upgrades, which wasn't so bad. In fact, that's exactly what I did for the blind playthrough, though I've since postponed the blind playthrough in favor of doing the walkthrough, given how underwhelming the gameplay quality is, and also due to how you can only get one specific false ending for the first playthrough. It's especially ridiculous that the developers label this an action horror game when its poor gameplay hardly feels action horror-esque. The gameplay is literally no different to Silent Hill 2 and 3 OG's general combat, aside from the camera perspective, parry, and dodge. If this qualifies as action horror, then by that logic, the classics most older players know as survival horror should also fall under that label. This is precisely why the term action horror is an ignorant piece of terminology, and it only serves to muddy the idea of what survival horror means, as I've said many times in my other videos. The developers are only proving me right when I say that action horror is a term that has no reason to exist, and they're only demonstrating how ignorant they are with such a concept. But that being said, the gameplay at times turns into Dark Souls, and you can clearly see the parallels between the gameplay of this game and Dark Souls. I was already so sick of the Souls formula saturating the entire games industry and diluting creativity, but the fact that it's now spreading to a series like Silent Hill is even more obnoxious. At least compared to the Souls series, this game actually embraces good checkpoints and not stupid, insignificant runbacks when getting back to a boss. I'll go into further detail in the later parts. But moving on to talking about Lost in the Fog difficulty, on this difficulty, you take more damage, the enemies have more HP, they're a bit more resistant to being stunned in certain cases, and enemy and item placements are also different from the other difficulties. For example, for this beginning area, the mannequin-like enemies, which are called Kashimashis, will be hiding around many of the corners on Lost in the Fog difficulty. But in general, some of these enemy placements are badly thought out in other parts of the game, and they reveal a lack of understanding from the developers regarding their own core gameplay designs, a trait that's unfortunately inherited from the Souls series. I'll discuss these parts when they occur. But right there, I dodged past that first Kashimashi, and you'll notice that I did the grab instantly. Don't let that fool you. The reason why I did the grab instantly is because it was doing a scripted grab. When they're doing the actual grab attack animation in the middle of combat, they have to go through a lengthy startup frame period before they attack, which is of course common sense, since if they could spam grab instantly like that, it would be very bullcrap. But there is another Kashimashi, so make sure you dodge at the right moment in order to avoid the attack. You can typically tell when you're supposed to dodge the moment you see them start to move. But after grabbing the key right here, there's going to be another Kashimashi that's very easy to get past. It's going to be to your left, but you have to go right and then go through the door. You'll notice that I got stuck on the stool for a bit. That's something that occurs often with this game. The movement on this game is incredibly rigid and stiff, so you end up clipping on objects constantly whenever you're running or whenever you're trying to readjust yourself after a dodge. Silent Hill 2 Remix movement is far better than this game's movement system. Silent Hill 2 Remix gameplay in general is far better than Silent Hill F's gameplay. I already had a feeling it was going to be as such when I was seeing the initial gameplay of Silent Hill F, but playing it now, my predictions definitely came true. But you saw the shrine for a bit, that shows that I don't have any Emma upgrades, and I also picked up the kitchen knife. The kitchen knife is one of the most powerful weapons in this game. I know it doesn't seem like it, but trust me guys, the kitchen knife is very powerful against some mini bosses later on. But I got past that Kashimashi, and there are going to be two more Kashimashis right in front of me, so I'm just going to run past them, and then there's going to be a mandatory combat encounter against three Kashimashi. The first Kashimashi is easy to dispatch, but the other two can be really obnoxious because of how awkward the combat is on this game. But use a heavy attack to stun this Kashimashi and then finish it off while it's in its weakened state, and then the second and third Kashimashi will spawn. I recommend using a focus attack to stun this second Kashimashi, since the heavy attack is inconsistent with stunning these Kashimashi. I think I didn't do it here because charging a focus attack with the pipe takes longer than with the bat, and I didn't want to waste durability on the bat too early. But there is a counter, so whenever the enemies go into specific animations and you see that visual effect, it means you can press the heavy attack button and do a counter that will give you iframes, and it will stun the enemy all the time. And there is a focus attack, so whenever you hold L2 and you wait for the circle to fill, you can then press the light attack attack button while you're holding L2, and you will be able to do that focus attack. Most of the time, the focus attacks will stun the enemies, but I have had moments where the focus attacks have failed to actually stun the enemies and put them into a weakened state. I don't know why it's inconsistent like that, and you can see how awkward the combat is when dealing with multiple enemies, because these Kashimashi will never flinch from my light attacks, and the only possible way I can safely deal with them is by using the counter against them, or by using my focus attacks, which will put them into their weakened states. This is how the general combat loop always goes with these encounters. Because the flinch animations are lacking with the enemies, you're pretty much forced to play the counter game against the enemies until you happen to get openings where you can hit the enemies during their weakened states and speed up the process. That's how stripped down the gameplay is, and it's really dumb, yet they opt for a lot of these mandatory combat encounters. It's one of the reasons why the Dark Shrine encounters are the weakest parts of the game. And speaking of the Dark Shrine, we're actually in the realm right now, so on New Game Plus, you have the ability to immediately input the code that allows you to unlock the door and get the key. You then have to escape from these Kamugaras before you lose your health and sanity. These enemies are way faster than you and will always do a fast swipe to punish you for sprinting when they catch up to you. So whenever one is closing in on you, either be ready to dodge or slow down and wait for them to do one of their regular attacks before running away again. If they end up doing their 9-hit combo move, that's good because you have plenty of time to get away from them. Also, be careful of the scripted moments where Hinako is forced to stop due to head pain. This can give the Kamugaras a chance to swipe at you. You can skip the head pain animation by dodging, but that's assuming you have the stamina to do so. But I just picked up a Higashi, and I'm also picking up the sickle. I'm then going to run all the way to the second Jizo statue to pick up the Sacred Sword, which is where it'll always be in future playthroughs after you've satisfied the prerequisites for unlocking the Sacred Sword. The Higashi is needed for the next Dark Shrine encounter because there's a massive running moment that requires unlimited stamina, and the sickle is needed for the upcoming encounter with the Arabare in this area, since I'll be using it to deal with some Kashimashi that support the Arabare. The baseball bat is also going to be used in the upcoming encounter, since I'll be using its focus attack to stun a Kashimashi and set it up for being killed by the sickle. You will get a replacement sickle in the Scarecrow puzzle section, so you're free to use as much durability on this sickle as you want. One thing to note about the sickle, even though it's technically a sharp weapon like the kitchen knife, it doesn't actually deal the same amount of damage as the kitchen knife. Its focus attack is also not capable of stunning enemies consistently like with the kitchen knife's focus attack, which is rather odd. But this is the encounter with the Arabare. What you need to do at the start is stand right here and bait out this specific attack because he has a lot of recovery after this particular move. So this gives me plenty of time to turn the crank once, and as soon as I turn the crank once, this Kashimashi will spawn in. So like I said, I'm going to use the focus attack on my baseball bat to stun this enemy and set it up for being killed by the sickle. After it's dead, I'm going to run backwards into a corner and bait this Arabare to do the sword slam again because it'll give it a lot of recovery frames, and whenever he does the sword slam in this particular spot, he has a lot of trouble getting to you when you're on the crank. So you can turn this crank twice in the process, but as soon as you turn the crank a second time, a second Kashimashi will spawn, and it's worth noting that the Arabare is capable of stunning the Kashimashis with its attacks, and that actually happens here when it tries to use its tentacle to grab me. But there's the stun on the Kashimashi, and the Arabare is currently in a recovery period, so I'm going to use the time to open the door to the storehouse, which takes a while to do. You have to not only open the lock, but also slowly open the door and move some planks out of the way. And once these planks are out of the way and you mantle through the window, the cutscene will trigger, and that will be the end of this combat encounter. Bear in mind, you can take damage during mantle animations, which is stupid because Hinako takes ages to do such animations. And it's not just mantle animations, it's also when she's dropping down or opening doors. She is in no hurry to get away from the enemies when they're nearby, so you end up taking damage through a very cheap manner. I have no idea why this slipped the developers' minds, but there were many cheap moments like that in the parts of the blind playthrough that I uploaded. And since we're on the topic of damage, one thing worth noting is that whenever you transition between the overworld and the Dark Shrine, Hinako regains all her health and sanity, so that's why you haven't really been seeing me use healing items a lot. And previously I was going to do no damage, but then I remember there were a lot of bullshit parts of the game where you take damage very quickly, and I don't really like this game that much in terms of its gameplay, so I didn't want to give this game any credit. But then I thought of doing no healing, which I then decided to drop because of bosses like Rinko, where the hitboxes on their fire attacks are horrible, and also with certain combat encounters where you're playing as Fox Hinako. The gameplay quality is not that polished to allow no damage and no healing to be done in a feasible manner. And even if I was using the Emma upgrades, I doubt the quality of the gameplay would improve because the poor quality of the gameplay isn't based around the statistics the Emma upgrades focus on. The same also applies to a general playthrough where I'm simply playing the game without worrying about no damage and no healing. It can be really hard to enjoy this game on the gameplay side. At least certain aspects like the voice acting are miles ahead of the previous Silent Hill games in terms of quality. There were even certain story moments that I got invested in more so than in the previous Silent Hill games. It's just a shame that this game's gameplay is a downgrade from Silent Hill 2 Remake's gameplay. But we're back in the Dark Shrine, and we're dealing with the Dark Shrine variants of the Kashimashis, which are known as Hirai Katashiros. These variants aren't as time-consuming to deal with compared to the Kashimashi, since they aren't as passive and they tend to use counterable attacks as their first attacks, often whenever they get near you after approaching you from a distance. However, when there are multiple of them, or they're paired with other enemies, they end up being quite passive, since the game often has trouble deciding which enemy it wants to prioritize. And like I said before, encounters with multiple enemies often boil down to just countering enemy attacks and keeping your distance, given how rudimentary the gameplay is and how lacking the flinch animations are with the enemies. Also, I recommend getting rid of this Katashiro, because whenever you're in these locked view moments where you're seeing, like right here with the Zenari sculpture being put in place and the door opening, the enemies are moving during these moments, and it's really dumb. But once you get through this opening and you pick up the Naginata and avoid this Katashiro right over here, there's going to be a moment where you have to run past a bunch of Katashiros. So when you take this path right here, there's going to be one Katashiro that spawns in front of you, but then there's going to be another one in the ceiling. You have to use the perfect dodge. If your timing is off just a little bit, you will take damage. It's that strict on the timing. And then with this third one, either run past it or use the counter to stun it. I'm going to use the counter to stun it because I know it'll most likely do a counterable attack as its first attack, and I'm going to get through this opening. And on Lost in the Fog difficulty, there is another Katashiro hiding around the corner, so be ready to dodge the moment you see it twitch like that. And then when you get to the next area, there are going to be more Katashiro chasing you, so when you get to this area right over here, there's going to be one hiding around the corner, so be ready to use the perfect dodge. And I'm going to go straight instead of going left, and there's going to be another Katashiro hiding in the ceiling, so be ready to dodge. And then there's going to be another one right in front of you. Typically its back is to you, but still do the dodge, because the Katashiro can still initiate their frontal attacks even when their back is to you at times. And then that right there, normally that Katashiro is supposed to do the jump attack on you, but I think because of the way I was moving, I managed to get it to drop down instead of doing the jump attack, so maybe that's a consistent method. But this part right here, before you pick up the orb, make sure you use a Higashi to give yourself unlimited stamina for this part, since this is a massive running moment. It varies with how this sequence will turn out, because these celluloid dolls that scream, which are called Oyomoi, are random when they choose to scream. They're also bullcrap, because even when you perfectly dodge the scream, you'll still be affected by the scream if you're still within its radius. In fact, it happens right here, so I perfectly dodged the scream, but because I'm still technically inside the scream's radius, I end up getting caught. What's the point of a perfect dodge if I'm still going to be affected by attacks? A perfect dodge is supposed to be complemented by a disabled hitbox, otherwise the mechanic ends up feeling dishonest and broken. And given the core gameplay designs this game favors, it's only logical that a perfect dodge will be designed as such, but apparently not in this case. But I'm nearing the end of the sequence, so I'm going to take the time to talk about Sakuko's boss fight. This is a time-consuming encounter, and you have to play it safe, because just like the bosses in Dark Souls 3, Sakuko has access to variable combos, meaning she can dynamically add on to combos depending on how close you are to her. So for instance, if you're close to her after she does that long-range attack where she launches her weapon at you, she'll add an attack where she will launch her weapon again. If you're to her side, she'll swing the weapon sideways to hit you after she launches her weapon. There really is no incentive in indulging in these variable combos because she doesn't stay in recovery animations long enough. I can't say I understand why they would put in these variable combos for Sakuko when Hinako is incredibly sluggish when attacking. How exactly is the player meant to punish Sakuko in order to contribute to a properly paced encounter without doing what I'm doing initially, where I'm baiting out Sakuko's long-range attack, then getting close to her to make her do the counterable attack? It makes no sense. And by the way, this method I'm doing will not work when she's low on HP, because instead of doing the counterable attack, she'll do other attacks like the grab or the repeated swing combo. When you get to that part, it's best you punish the grab or the move where she tries to drain your sanity. Also, on Lost in the Fog difficulty, Sakuko will gain the ability to teleport behind you into your side, so you have to be ready to turn the camera while running to see what she's doing. She'll primarily gain the ability to teleport after the first sanity draining phase, and when I'm referring to the sanity draining phase, I'm referring to the parts where she slams her weapon together, it goes dark, and you have to stun her 3 times to prevent her from draining your sanity. The sanity draining phases are dumb because at times she can teleport so far away from you that you won't have enough time to stop her. Hinako just isn't able to move fast enough to keep up with Sakuko in such cases. Additionally, I don't know why, but the amount of hits you have to deal to Sakuko to stun her is increased from 2 hits to 4 hits, which is incredibly idiotic when it's complementing her long-distance teleporting. It's just adding additional downtime to allow her to drain your sanity for a completely unjustified reason. Also, I don't know if focus attacks work on Sakuko, because during my blind playthrough, when I tried to use focus attacks on her, nothing was happening. I know that focus attacks work on Rinko, but I don't understand why the focus attacks weren't working against Sakuko on my blind playthrough. Overall, Sakuko is was just a dull encounter, and the feeling of boredom always crosses my mind anytime I think about replaying this game and coming back to this encounter. It's also why, even after getting damaged in this recording, I don't restart because I just want to get the encounter done. Even still though, Sakuko's boss fight isn't as bad as Rinko's boss fight, but I'll talk about that boss fight later on. We're now in the first sanity draining phase, so right now you have to use the audio to pinpoint where Sakuko is and hit her 4 times to stun her. Sakuko likes to primarily spawn off camera, so you can kind of use the camera to influence where she spawns, but it doesn't always work. And once you've done this sanity draining phase, the fight will resume as normal, and it'll take quite a while to get to the final sanity draining phase where you have to stun her repeatedly again, and then she finally goes down. So given that there's not much to really say about this particular boss fight, since the strategy is simple to replicate and doesn't require much explanation, and this boss fight is quite lengthy, I'm just gonna go on different tangents. So the first thing I want to say is that I've been very busy with work, which is why the uploads have been significantly slower. It's not that big of a deal given that my job is fantastic, and also because I'm finding it challenging at the moment to really get hyped for new content on my channel. There are definitely some games I'm looking forward to covering on my channel. Obviously, Resident Evil Requiem is the game I'm looking forward to the most, given that it's a new Resident Evil title, of course. As for the remake of my Resident Evil Village retrospective, progress has stalled, given that I'm more in the mood to play games rather than write about games right now, and it's like anytime the thought of doing my remade retrospective crosses the mind, something else diverts my attention. But then again, I did refer to my remade retrospective as a 5 years later retrospective, so I guess I'm using that as a reason to procrastinate a bit before 2026. It's a normal mindset that occurs when making game retrospectives. If you were in my position, you'd feel exactly the same if you've gone through what I've gone through with making these retrospectives. I do want to eventually get started on my playthrough of Resident Evil 2 OG, just like what I did with Resident Evil 3 OG, because I really liked that particular playthrough of Resident Evil 3 OG, but I'm not sure when I'll start my Resident Evil 2 OG playthrough. Aside from Resident Evil content, I will try to resume my Devil May Cry 3 playthrough after doing this walkthrough. Then there are the playthroughs of Devil May Cry 4 and 5 in the future, and with Devil May Cry 4, I can at least play Dante Must Die difficulty at the start thanks to a microtransaction I purchased. Moving on to another tangent, I want to talk about Silent Hill F's endings because I don't really understand the justification for making the player go through multiple playthroughs to unlock the true ending. In the other Silent Hill games, you could get any ending you wanted in one playthrough, but in this game, it's just needless tedium. Why do we have to unlock 2 separate endings to get the true ending? What does a random sacred sword have to do with the endings when we never see the sacred sword used in important cutscenes? Why do we have to see false dialogue in cutscenes initially? Like, it doesn't really make sense. I doubt Hinako is stuck in some kind of time loop like James was in Silent Hill 2 Remake. I can definitely agree with one of my subscribers regarding this point on how tedious the multiple playthrough format for the endings is. I will say though, I do like how in New Game Plus they shorten certain sections. For instance, in the middle school, you can immediately access the locker room, get the cabinet key, and then get the gate key to finish the entire section. Also, in the Dark Shrine, because Fox Hinako spawns with all her abilities at an early point, it means you don't have to do some badly designed combat sections, and you can just get to Rinko's boss fight quickly on New Game Plus. And also, on New Game Plus, when you're playing as Fox Hinako, you can actually use items that normally restore your sanity to charge your special ability. Personally, I don't really understand why this wasn't a default thing with New Game. On New Game, you instead have to waste time using Soul Siphon on dead enemies in order to charge your special ability. Why the developers would want the player to waste time mindlessly grinding like that only on New Game is beyond me. It is such a bizarre mindset. And speaking of mindsets, can I just say how strange it is how the game design for the overworld sections flips at a certain point? In the overworld sections before Shu's house, you're pretty much doing nothing but running past the enemies, but then after Shu's house, the game is all of a sudden expecting you to engage in a lot of combat with the enemies. I question why this is the case. The game doesn't really warn you that this is happening, it just drops a new enemy type on you, which is the Hatcher mini-boss that spawns those eggs, and it just expects you to fight this enemy multiple times. And given that before encountering the overworld Hatchers, you were fighting the Dark Shrine Hatchers in mandatory combat because of some magical force locking you in rooms, you wouldn't think the same with the overworld Hatchers, but instead of a magical force locking you in encounters with the overworld Hatchers, it's organic matter that's blocking you off. If the Dark Shrine Hatchers didn't have this capability, why would the overworld Hatchers have this capability of creating organic matter to block you off? It makes no sense at all. And that right there was unfortunate. So that was the moment when I got damaged by Sakuko because she teleported rather close to me and my timing was off a bit, so that's why I took damage. And I'm going to speed this up right now because this boss fight is just taking far too long. It's so dull and so uninteresting. This is literally what Silent Hill 3's bosses are like on Extreme 10 difficulty without dragged out they are because the bosses have so much life. But we're on the final sanity draining phase, and once I do this phase, Sakuko will be dead, and that'll be the end of this video. So stay tuned for the future parts. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.